All right, let's dive into something a little different today. We're going to take a deep dive into a character you might not think too much about at first. The lieutenant from Noli Me Tangere. Now, you all know the novel. It's a classic of Filipino lit, right? Taking on Spanish colonialism head on. And it doesn't shy away from those super intense social dynamics at the time. But the lieutenant, well, he's not Ibarra. He's not Maria Clara. Yet he's got this really unique perspective on the whole power struggle thing that I think is really fascinating.
Absolutely. And you know, he represents a very specific kind of authority. He's caught in this in-between space between the harshness of a figure like Padre Damaso, and then there's this more nuanced perspective, even maybe sympathetic at times, that emerges as the story unfolds. And the sources we have really highlight how it's not just his position, but his interactions. They all point to something bigger about what life was like in the Philippines under Spanish rule.
Yeah, okay, so one thing that really jumped out at me
Mm,
as I was going through all these sources
yeah.
was how the lieutenant is initially described as being quite threatening to Padre Damaso.
Yeah.
I mean, he practically challenges him to a duel there in social cancer. But then later, he kind of walks it back, blames it on having too much sherry. What's the deal with that? It almost seems, I don't know, out of character.
Yeah, it's not a simple answer. And that's actually what makes him so interesting, right? I think the way to think about it is he's navigating a minefield. It's a minefield of power,
Yeah,
his
okay.
authority, yeah. But he's still under figures like Padre Damaso,
Yeah.
who, let's be real, represents the church's massive influence within the colony. So it's almost like he's trying to balance this sense of personal honor, maybe even a flicker of justice, within a system that is deeply, deeply corrupt.
So it's less about him being a hothead and more about him trying to figure out where he stands in this really messed up system.
Exactly. And you know, what's really interesting is that social cancer makes a point of mentioning his 2 stars, his rank. And that hierarchy wasn't just for show, right? It dictated everything. So even if he has doubts, he can't just openly defy someone like Padre Damaso. He's trapped by the structure itself.
Right, and that incident at the feast
Hmm.
really drives that home, doesn't it?
Right.
She basically has to sit there and take Padre Damaso's insults
Hmm.
because of that power dynamic, even if he might personally disagree.
Precisely. And it makes you wonder, too, about his interactions with Ibarra. You can sense a certain level of respect there, maybe even some agreement with Ibarra's more progressive ideas. But again, his hands are tied by his role, his loyalty to the Spanish government.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me, because we have to remember, and history of the Philippines really lays this out, the lieutenant, as a representative of the Spanish crown, is essentially a foreigner, ruling over a people with their own deeply rooted customs and traditions. It's not just a political thing, right? This is a clash of cultures at its core.
And that clash, that's what fuels so much of the tension that ultimately explodes in Noli Me Tangere. Because the Spanish weren't just imposing laws, they were trying to reshape Filipino life completely. I mean, the encomienda system, as described in Pacification and Exploitation, is a perfect example of this. Spanish settlers were given land, and they were given the right to demand labor from the Filipinos who lived on that land. It created this massive gap between the Spanish elite and everyone else.
And the church was right in the middle of all that, too.
Oh, absolutely. Social cancer doesn't shy away from that at all. Friar estates, the church accumulating land and wealth, all of that added to this feeling among Filipinos that they were being exploited, not just ruled.
So even the lieutenant
Mm.
isn't some, mustache-twirling villain. He's still part of that machine, right?
He is, and in the eyes of many Filipinos, he represents that oppression, even if personally he might be wrestling with some of those same moral dilemmas, and that's one of the things that makes him such a complicated figure.
That's a great point. It's like he's this microcosm
Yeah.
of the whole colonial problem.
Yeah.
You have this individual struggle, but it's playing out against this massive historical backdrop that shapes everything.
You hit the nail on the head, and that's what we're going to be unpacking even further. As we dive deeper into the lieutenant's story, it's not just about him. It's about understanding colonialism itself through the lens of this one. Really fascinating character.
Okay, so we're back, and we're really digging into this lieutenant character from Noli Me Tangere. We talked about where he fits in, his relationships with Padre Damaso and Ibarra. But now I want to get into his head a little bit. Like, what's going on with this guy psychologically?
Well, to really get that, we have to kind of read between the lines. Remember, Rizal was a master at showing how colonialism messed people up, and not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. The lieutenant, he's almost like a case study in that.
Okay, so give me the psychological lowdown. What kind of mental gymnastics is this guy going through?
One word: ambiguity. He's torn between doing his duty, which, let's face it, means upholding laws designed to oppress Filipinos. And then he has this sense of justice, this thing that keeps popping up. Remember when he arrests Ibarra? He practically apologizes while doing it.
Yeah, it's like he's got major cognitive dissonance going on. He sees how wrong things are, but he's also bought into the system, right? For our listeners who might not be familiar with that term, cognitive dissonance basically means holding two conflicting beliefs at the same time, which honestly causes a lot of mental discomfort and stress. I feel like we've all been there.
Exactly. And it's eating him up inside. He's trying so hard to make his actions fit with his idea of himself as this honorable man.
Talk about an internal conflict, right?
Absolutely.
And you have to remember the time period, too. Back then, men were expected to be tough, in charge, showing doubt or uncertainty, not exactly considered manly.
That's such a key point. Colonialism, it twists expectations for everyone. He can't show weakness. So all that conflict, all that doubt, it just stews inside him.
It's almost like those blow-ups with Padre Damaso. Like he's redirecting all that pressure outward because he can't deal with it internally. It's like that whole Sherry excuse. Is it really just the booze, or is it a way to avoid taking responsibility?
It makes you think, doesn't it?
For me, that was the moment where I started to see just how deep his inner conflict really runs.
You know, it's fascinating how Riesel shows us that colonialism hurts everyone involved, even the colonizers, like the lieutenant. They end up twisting themselves into knots, trying to justify the system. It's not just about physical harm, it's about this moral injury, too.
Man, Riesel was so sharp. Okay, so we see this guy clinging to honor, to duty. He mentions those concepts a lot. But how does that even work when the system itself is built on dishonorable actions, on exploitation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think Riesel leaves it open for us to ponder. You have to remember, the lieutenant, he's a product of his culture. He's been told that Spain is doing a good thing, bringing civilization to the Philippines. He wants to believe that, even when he sees evidence to the contrary, happening right in front of him.
So he's in denial.
Yeah, you could say that.
He can't face the truth because it would shatter his whole worldview.
It's a psychological defense mechanism. If he admits the truth, he has to admit that he's part of the problem, and that's a heavy burden to carry.
But that kind of denial can't last forever, right? I mean, the rebellion is brewing. Things are about to get very real for him.
That's what makes the lieutenant such a tragic figure, you know?
Yeah.
We know he's going to have to make choices with huge consequences. For himself and everyone around him, he's at the heart of this conflict, caught between his own beliefs and the harsh reality of what colonialism is doing.
It makes you wonder, could he have broken free? Could he have chosen a different path?
Yeah.
Or was he always destined to play this role?
That's the question. Whether someone so deeply entrenched in a harmful system can truly change, it's something we'll keep exploring as we go even deeper into Noli Tangere. But for now, maybe we should shift gears a bit. We've talked about the lieutenant's inner world, but we also need to remember that he's operating within a much bigger historical context.
Totally. Building on that idea of historical context, I think it's time we zoom out and look at the larger forces shaping the Philippines during this era. It's going to get a little history heavy for a minute, but trust me, it all comes back to our friend, the lieutenant, and why he matters so much in this story. Welcome back, folks. We've been spending some time with the lieutenant from Noli Tangere, really trying to understand his inner world, his struggles. But let's circle back to those historical sources we've got. They're not just there for background, right? They really help us make sense of the whole world that shaped him and his choices.
Yeah, he's like a puzzle piece. And the history of the Philippines, that's the bigger picture he fits into. He didn't just pop into existence, right? He's a product of centuries of Spanish colonial rule. To really grasp him, we have to grasp that larger story.
Okay, so history lesson time. We know Spain was in the Philippines for a long time. What were some of the major elements of their rule, and how did all that impact Filipinos?
Oh, well, one word, encomienda. This system, as described in Pacification and Exploitation, basically turned the Philippines into a feudal state. Spanish settlers were given these huge tracts of land and the right to make Filipinos on that land work for them. It created this massive imbalance of power between the Spanish elite and everyone else.
And the church, of course, was a major player in all this.
Oh, absolutely. The church was Spain's partner in all this. You know, friars were often the first point of contact between the Spanish and the Filipinos. And some, you know, they genuinely wanted to convert people to Christianity, to provide education and healthcare. But others, well, they were more focused on power and wealth, amassing huge estates. And we see that reflected in Padre Damaso's character in Noli Me Tangere.
So you've got this system designed to extract wealth and resources from the Philippines, send it all back to Spain, and the church is backing it all up. No wonder Filipinos were unhappy.
Exactly, and that unhappiness, it led to rebellions, uprisings throughout the centuries. Local chiefs, datists, they would lead these revolts, trying to resist Spanish rule, protect their traditional ways of life.
And that resistance, it took different forms too, right? Not just armed rebellion,
Mhm.
but also just holding on to their culture, their languages.
Absolutely. Filipinos found ways to push back, even within the confines of the system. They learned Spanish, they converted to Christianity, but they never completely surrendered their identity. They found clever ways to subvert the power dynamics to keep their culture alive.
So enter the lieutenant into this situation. Centuries of colonial rule, centuries of resistance. He can't escape that history. It's all around him.
I think that's a key takeaway here. The lieutenant, he really embodies the contradictions of colonialism. He might sincerely believe he's doing good, bringing progress, civilization, all that. But he's also a cog in a machine designed to control and exploit. It's like he's caught in this web he didn't weave, but is now completely tangled in.
And that web, it's inherently corrupt, right? It's not just a few bad apples. The whole system is rotten to the core.
Exactly, and you know what they say about corrupt systems? They eventually crumble. You can't keep exploiting people forever. They will rise up, they will fight back.
And in the Philippines, that fight was already starting to gain momentum.
Exactly, the lieutenant, he's there for those early tremors of an earthquake that's eventually going to shatter Spanish rule. And his choices, his actions, they all play a role in that outcome, even if he can't see it yet.
It's like he's standing right on a fault line and doesn't even know it's about to crack wide open.
And what's really tragic is that, as we've discussed, he's not this one-dimensional villain. He has moments of decency, of recognizing the injustice around him, but he's trapped by the very system he represents.
So in a way, he's a victim too. A victim of his role, of these historical forces he can't escape.
He is, he might get these glimpses of a different path, but he's ultimately bound by the rules of a rigged game. And those rules, well, they were designed to benefit the colonizers at the expense of the Filipinos.
All right, let's zoom out to the big picture for a second. What does the lieutenant's story tell us about colonialism in general? Are there lessons we can learn even today from this character and his struggles?
I think the biggest lesson, the most important one, is that colonialism dehumanizes everyone involved. It creates power structures that corrupt those in charge. And it sends this message to those being ruled, that they're less than human.
And it relies on violence to maintain that power.
Right.
I mean, we see that throughout Noli Tangere.
Oh, absolutely. Violence is baked into the very DNA of colonialism. Whether it's physical force, economic exploitation, suppression of culture, it's all violence, all aimed at controlling and subjugating an entire population.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to this question. Can someone like the lieutenant, someone so deeply complicit in a harmful system, ever truly find redemption?
That's a tough one, and I think it's a question every reader has to grapple with. But Marcel, he makes us confront it. Can people change? Can they break free from the systems that shape them? Even systems built on violence and injustice.
And maybe that's the most important takeaway here. It's not just a history lesson, right? It's a challenge to look at the systems we're all part of today, to ask ourselves, are we the lieutenant? Are we upholding something harmful, even if we don't realize it? And if so, what are we going to do about it?
Those are powerful questions, and ones that stay with you long after you finish reading Noli Me Tangere. That's what makes it such a great work of literature. It makes you think, it makes you question, it makes you uncomfortable.
And that's what we strive for here on The Deep Dive, to take these complex ideas, these amazing stories, and really unpack them together. So thank you all for joining us on this journey into the world of Noli Me Tangere and the enigmatic lieutenant. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep in